I am a psychologist in private practice in Hamilton, Ontario. And in my practice, my main focus is on grief and trauma. I don't currently work with individuals with schizophrenia. My main experience with individuals with schizophrenia came from my doctoral training and then some of my own personal experience when I lived next door to a woman who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. I think, as many of you probably know and understand today, mental illness can be difficult to understand, and I think that schizophrenia is perhaps one of the more poorly understood mental illnesses among the mental health disorders. As I said, my exposure and experience with schizophrenia came as part of my doctoral training when I completed an internship at the Hamilton Program for Schizophrenia. And through that training, I came to witness firsthand the impact that a severe mental illness can have on an individual and on that individual's family. I saw families come to struggle to understand the impact of the illness and the symptoms of the illness. I saw individuals with the diagnosis come to understand their own symptoms. And I saw that while some individuals gain insight into their illness, some never do. And importantly, I also saw how a psychosocial rehabilitation program could well support individuals and their families in recovery. In addition to my clinical experience, as I noted earlier, some 25 years ago, I lived beside a woman who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Initially, I was unaware of her mental illness. She never mentioned it, nor did her children, but then why would they? But I later learned that my neighbor had a very severe and enduring mental illness, and she had a history of erratic behavior. Prior to us moving in, she had come in contact with various hospitals, various doctors and psychiatrists, as well as the police. But she was never properly assessed or treated. There appeared to be a lack of coordination of service and a lack of any follow-up. And as I said earlier, my neighbor lacked insight into her illness, so she never saw the need to take the antipsychotic medication that was prescribed to her upon discharge. Initially, when we moved in, interactions with my neighbor were quite neighborly. We would chat over the fence, we would share tea, and she seemed happy to have new neighbors. In time, however, and most notably after the death of her son, we began to see some glimpses of her mental illness. And then when I became pregnant with my first son, we saw further glimpses of her illness. And we began to see some of this erratic behavior, which we later learned was guided by her delusional thinking. Her symptoms were further exacerbated by the birth of my son, and she became more erratic, more aggressive, and in time more violent. And I think it's important to point out, as many of you may know, most individuals with schizophrenia are not violent, but my neighbor was quite aggressive. Given her behavior and her delusional thinking, which I said became more apparent over time, and given her aggressive behavior, which was more and more directed towards me, we had called the police to our home more than a dozen times in a 3-year period, with the hope of having her apprehended and assessed. Her daughter also tried, without success, to have her mother apprehended, assessed, and into treatment. She had called the police as well on numerous occasions, and she had attended the Justice of the Peace on at least 2 occasions, but she too continually hit barriers. Our neighbor's daughter did not understand her mother's mental illness, and I would talk often with our neighbor's daughter, and on one occasion she had commented to me that the doctor had indicated that her mother suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and she asked me what those words meant. Clearly, there was no sharing of information from the family physician to the family in terms of their mother's mental illness. As we later learned, the family physician himself at the time did not know of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And like I said, my neighbor's daughter didn't understand her mother's mental illness, nor did she appreciate the quality of her mother's delusional thinking. On one occasion, she had said to me that the neighbors were indicating that my son was her son. And her daughter replied, "Mom, you know that's not true." And like I said, she didn't understand her mother's mental illness, and she didn't appreciate the quality of her mother's delusional thinking. She tried to correct it, and she tried to challenge it. In the end, it was her mother's delusional thinking that formed the basis of her actions to kill my son, to release the spirit of hers. We later learned that my neighbor believed that her son lived within Zachary. In order to release her son's spirit, she had to kill Zachary. After Zachary's death, I engaged in a long period of quiet healing until about 2013, when there were changes to the Not Criminally Responsible Act put forward by the government at the time, Prime Minister Harper. And I won't detail the changes, but they created in me a very uneasy and uncomfortable feeling. I felt that the changes being proposed were stigmatizing to individuals who had mental illness. They were punitive, and they lacked a poor understanding of schizophrenia. I felt the proposed changes and the associated media coverage was only serving to further perpetuate myths about schizophrenia. And I was upset by how Mr. Harper portrayed those with severe mental illness. So I was propelled at that time to become more public in my own experience, to hopefully join in the efforts to reduce stigma, to increase understanding of schizophrenia, and also to highlight the need of improved treatment and access to treatment, such that further tragedies could be prevented, and such that individuals with severe and enduring mental illness might receive the treatment that they need and deserve. And while some gains have been made, I think we still have a long way to go, especially in terms of understanding severe and enduring mental illness, and in terms of access to a wider range of service. As I said at the outset, mental illness is complex and it's difficult to understand. And schizophrenia, I believe, is among the more poorly understood. And oftentimes when family members receive a diagnosis, they're not told what that means or what schizophrenia might look like. I think when people hear and think about schizophrenia, they most often think of the symptoms which are referred to as positive symptoms, namely the hallucinations and the delusions. And generally, the stories in the media, the high-profile cases about disturbed behavior, are often the result of these positive symptoms, which often have been untreated. As I said, my neighbor acted on her delusional thinking. In other high-profile cases, like Mr. Vincent Lee or Mr. Kashkar, also acted on their delusional thinking. And again, this coverage fuels myths about schizophrenia, including that notion that individuals with schizophrenia are violent, when, as we said earlier, only a small percentage of individuals with schizophrenia are violent. Often, they're more often the victims of violence. And in all the cases mentioned, and I think in my case as well, if the individuals had received proper treatment, the outcomes may have been different. The delusions that we talk about are fixed beliefs. And in my training at the Hamilton Program for Schizophrenia, I came to see that these beliefs are very true to the individual who holds them, despite the fact that the beliefs are false. They're fixed beliefs that the individual strongly believes, and they're very real to them. And often, they're not amenable to change. Hallucinations are the voices that people hear or things they may see that others don't see. And while when we think of schizophrenia, I think the general public often thinks of those positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is also characterized by a range of other symptoms, symptoms beyond the positive ones, and which typically involve a loss in reduction or a loss in capacity, which can have a great impact on an individual's day-to-day functioning. And these symptoms are often referred to as the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. They can greatly impact a person's quality of life and their ability to experience many of the life-fulfilling activities that so many of us take for granted, such as academic success, long-term relationships, employment, and/or financial stability. There's a number of different classification systems that speak about negative symptoms, but like I said, for the most part, they all note that they involve a loss or reduction in capacity. So a loss often of potential. Negative symptoms include blunted affect or lack of emotional expressiveness. So the individual with schizophrenia who shows this symptom typically shows very little emotional expression. There may be no eye contact or a lack of emotional expressiveness. And I think we can see how this could in turn impact one's functioning, particularly social functioning or even work functioning. Poverty of speech is another negative symptom, which refers to a decrease in verbal output or verbal expression. So the individual may speak in a monotone voice or with single syllables or provide very brief responses. Skills that are required to make small talk, which is so important in our society. And the loss of this important communication skill can again impact someone's ability to take part in social activities or work activities. Another negative symptom often described is avolition, an inability to initiate and follow through on goal-directed activities, often referred to as deficient or lack of motivation. Individuals who lack this ability often fail to tend to personal hygiene, or they may not participate in recreational activities. When a person living with schizophrenia lives at home, they may, like I said, not engage in personal hygiene. They may not complete their household tasks, and this can be difficult for family members. And particularly if they don't understand the symptom, it may be misinterpreted as laziness, and there could be potential conflict with family members. Anhedonia is another negative symptom, which is a diminished capacity to experience pleasure. Asociality is the lack of desire for the company of others. So oftentimes people with schizophrenia are more withdrawn and they don't engage in social relationships. So as you can imagine from this list of symptoms, the negative symptoms can greatly impact day-to-day functioning, from task initiation to social engagement to recreational activities to school success or work functioning. And as we said earlier as well, this impairment can then in turn impact family members who may be living with the individual with the diagnosis, because they're not always sure what they can do to assist or to help their loved ones. And sometimes, like we said, the behaviors can be misinterpreted. So, like we said at the outset, education and understanding of the range of symptoms is important. I think these symptoms also highlight the importance of treatment beyond medication, including psychosocial rehabilitation programs, which can target such behaviors, such as social skills, or can assist the individual with task planning and initiation. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia are also closely related to deficits in thinking or cognition. Research has demonstrated that individuals with schizophrenia often perform poorly on tests of cognitive functioning. They may have difficulty sustaining their attention or difficulty sort of switching their attention. And when I was at the Hamilton program for schizophrenia, my doctoral research involved looking at the effectiveness of an attention training program for individuals with schizophrenia. Individuals with schizophrenia often may struggle with higher order cognitive functioning that requires the initiation, planning, memory, and organizing thoughts. And again, as you can imagine, we all need cognitive functioning in all the tasks that we carry out. So deficits in these areas, again, impact day-to-day functioning. Bless you. Another common cognitive deficit in schizophrenia is lack of insight when one is not aware of having the illness. And as I said, my neighbor lacked insight into her illness. When an individual is diagnosed with schizophrenia, it's often difficult for that individual to reconcile with that diagnosis or to accept the diagnosis. And it's difficult for family members as well. As I indicated earlier, many family members have indicated to me that when the diagnosis is provided, they're not given much more information. So they don't know what the symptoms of the disorder may look like or what they may imply or how their loved one might be impacted. And as we just reviewed, schizophrenia does involve a range of symptoms and can impact a wide range of functioning. When I spoke before at Home on the Hill, we talked about grief associated with these range of losses. Loss of potential for the individual with a diagnosis, and loss of hopes and dreams sometimes for family members. So how do we cope with and move forward when we receive a diagnosis or a loved one receives a diagnosis of schizophrenia? I think, as we said at the outset, education is important, and this education can sometimes be obtained in a supportive therapeutic relationship. Education and supportive therapy can help the individual come to understand the disorder and the impact on functioning. As we spoke to at the previous event, sometimes people need the opportunity to be able to process what the diagnosis means to them and what the losses mean to them, both for the individual with the diagnosis and family members. Again, this can be done in a therapeutic relationship. Coping, particularly for family members, I think we often forget to take care of ourselves, and you have to give yourself permission to engage in good self-care, both for the individual with the diagnosis as well as family members. When a family member is diagnosed with schizophrenia, it can often take a financial cost, an emotional cost, a social cost, and sometimes family members forget to take care of themselves. So it's important to focus on your self-care as well. Peer support can be important, like Home on the Hill offers, for family members to support each other and share resources that they may have found helpful. Peer support can also be important for the individual who has received the diagnosis, to be with other people who've had to come to accept their diagnosis and work towards their recovery as well. There are also, as I mentioned earlier, different behavioral therapies such as social skills training, cognitive behavioral therapy for both individuals with the diagnosis and their family members, and rehabilitation programs to help with things like employment and housing. And as we'll learn later when our other panelist comes, there are creative therapy modalities as well, such as art therapy, to help individuals come together with a diagnosis and express themselves. And we'll hear about that a little later. So that gives, I think, a very broad overview of some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, and I think it highlights the impact that the range of symptoms can have on functioning, which I think is often not attended to sometimes by our healthcare professionals.